there are only 4 people. What shall
Prasanna
we
said he won't be coming.
do? Huh?
It's okay, we'll start. Prasanna said he won't be coming, so I'm not sure if anyone else will join.
Yeah. Okay, then I'm okay because I am going to learn today. I'll be happy to listen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll start.
Mhm.
Okay, so hello everyone. Uh, First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to Balaji for giving me this opportunity. Um, I think that as much as I liked math and physics, studying it as a high school student, I think this conversation about the truth involved in contentious biological concepts were really what um, made me serious about truth, personally speaking. Like everyone's having a debate about um, whether evolution is true, how was life formed. That's a very big open question, and it definitely is, conflicts with what many religions teach and things. So I think biology and understanding how it works is definitely something that can either be a spiritual experience, or it can have a very complex relationship with one's spirituality. So I thank I okay, next slide please. So I wanted to thank Balaji sir, Guru sir, and Divin Akshay for this
Mhm.
opportunity, and others who are involved in this idea behind this course. Next slide. So these are my sources, and I've used Wikipedia quite a lot. Disclaimer. Next slide. So there are so many people's names I have skipped out, and many people's names I mentioned that would not be mentioned in an introductory history of biology thing. And I just wanted to give a sense of what is involved in biological truth as it progressed down the ages. So it's a false but comprehensible sense of continuity. And definitely there will always be some Eurocentric bias. We're only crediting the people's histories who we can traditionally trace back as either Greek or Latin or European. Okay, next slide. So now to just give a simple overview of what happened is that you have to understand that at some point in the past, like say before 1600s or something, all of science could have been contained in one person's mind, even though the science of 600, 1600 was quite extensive. It it is not extensive to to the modern day, as extensive as the modern day. So it was possible for a handful of people to know a good proportion of what existed at the time. So you have Leibniz, who spoke 12 languages. You have, Fermat, who was a judge, mathematician. You have a lot of polymaths.
Mhm.
So at that time, biology was not studied separately. Whoever studied biology also studied different things. They were studying
Mhm.
nature. So it was called as natural philosophy. They were trying to understand natural principles. And my interest in doing this, my hidden agenda, so to speak, is also to understand in the modern day, there's only a limited kind of knowledge we can know. Even if we read as many books as we can, we'll probably only read around 1,000 books in our lifetime. So, there's a reflecting on the advances of AI and everything, there is a limit to knowledge and understanding that we are capable of. So, I feel like history should also, what is that, influence us or inspire us or give us a sense of how concepts changed. So
Mhm.
basically, I'm saying that it's very interesting to learn about the history of ideas,
Mhm.
because in the present day, a lot of people do not accept what we call as progress. I will come to this point at a later time. And also,
Mhm.
just a small note of that history of biology. A lot of these great people, they may or may not have been married. So they may have certain sexist beliefs. So, right throughout the history of biology, we keep hearing that women were deficient, or in some way man was greater, some biological basis. So, we'll touch upon this also a little bit later. Next slide, please. So, in the prehistoric time, humans have had knowledge about plants, medicine, and agriculture, and we have mummified remains of a body called Otzi around 3000 BC, and we can see that he's even though he's not part of a main civilization, so to speak, he's he's a farmer. He's having some herbs in his pocket, and even before, and they used to self treat themselves. So they had knowledge, but we don't have evidence of it because it wasn't written down. And even though we say that the agricultural revolution is around 10,000 BC, there is evidence that human beings knew how to plant and how to, grow things and how to deal with animals long before 10,000 BC. Okay, next slide. So now we come to when people started coming together and civilizations were being, forming after the agricultural revolution. Everyone's becoming sedentary. So uh, we have Egyptian people trying to discover ophthalmologic surgery, Mesopotamians who studied animal behavior because they were cutting up the livers, cutting up the livers of the animals and doing divination, trying to, find out what is the divine, uh, um, the divine message for them as a culture. And they also had to study animal behavior to train them and to domesticate them. And China had its own, and a lot of these civilizations, whether Chinese, Indian, or Greek, they all had some kind of understanding of there being only four elements. But the Chinese system was a little bit different in that their four elements, it was more about the four processes. Okay, some certain kinds of processes that allowed life to be in balance and was a contrast between opposites. That was their kind of understanding of life. And they had their own herbologists, physicians, and alchemists who tried to find the drug for eternal life. So obviously, they would have had some understanding of what is healing to some extent, to some limited extent. Then we have the Indian Ayurvedic knowledge from the Atharva Veda. So Ayurvedic knowledge will obviously be its own very old oral history passed down. And at some point, somebody decided to codify it in a uh, poetic manner. So, and we also have surgical knowledge through Shushruta. Some surgeries, they used to say he used to suture wounds with ants. Ant bite would close the, what do you say, close the wound, and then they cut off the ant's head and would smash it. So that but the ant's teeth would hold it together. And basic principles of sterilization also. And his Shushruta Samhita also was an earlier materia medica, which contained different preparations from different sources, plant, mineral, and animal. So what we have to understand is that ancient civilizations and prehistoric people, they were advanced in their management of natural systems. They didn't document how they managed everything, right? Because a management is a kind of a system where you have certain trees growing, you have certain plants, and the only thing they would document is if it was connected to a king or something like that. And the king would have its own religious thing going around. So we think they are being primitive, but we do not know actually how primitive or how advanced they truly were, because that management aspect of how they manage their environment is lost. But we think that because they survived for such a long time, they were fairly advanced. So that is something we have to keep in mind. Okay, next slide.
Before that,
Yes.
I have one question.
Yes.
What do you mean by materia medica?
So materia medica. So materia means materials. Medica means the medicines you make out of it. So they had like for example, let's say I have some kind of preparation to cure the fever, let's say,
Mhm.
and and I would have a list of drug combinations.
Mhm.
So, for example, I would have, say, 50 drugs for that, 50 drug combinations. First
Mhm.
drug combination would be some root from some plant, and
Mhm.
maybe a claw of a rabbit or some bird or some feather or something. Various organic materials, and or some kind of mineral, maybe some
Mhm.
ore, some mineral ore, or a little bit of salt, or
Mhm.
salt from the salt water from the sea. So they would have different combinations of this, and they believed that it was therapeutic.
So this is a system of medicine. Basically,
So materia
uh,
medica is just this kind of system that human beings have been using for a long time, whether it is Ayurveda, whether it is homeopathy, whether it is
Mhm.
medieval medicine. They used to try to codify whatever they knew in terms
Mhm.
of oral medicine, oral histories of medicine, into a book, which contained like a
Okay.
different recipe to make a medicine.
Okay, that's
they,
called
they didn't
medicine.
have they didn't have the pharmaceutical industry that time, so
Yeah.
people used to make their own small laboratories and mix these drugs together. So
Okay.
materia medica would be for these people who mix these kind of drugs. They're called apothecaries
Okay.
in
Okay.
the Europe.
Okay. Okay.
So that is a materia medica. Now this is a nice picture. I just wanted to explain to you a little bit how interesting this is actually. So the black arrows. So this is a Chinese principle. First of all, this is a Chinese principle of the five phases. It's we commonly say it's a five elements, but the Chinese had a little bit different understanding of the relationship they had with each other. So the understanding was that the black arrows are generative phases, and the white arrows are destructive phases. So, for example, metal, if you heat it very to high temperatures, it will flow like water. Water, when you put it into the soil, it it allows for the growth of wood. Wood, when you again heat it to high temperatures and catch fire to it, it will become more fire. It adds more fire, and fire, after you allow it to burn for a while, forms ash, which again goes into the earth. And earth is where metals are found. So that is a generative cycle that they believed. And the destructive cycle, an example would be something like uh, metal that is used from an axe would cut the wood. The wood would can be used to build dams, and I'm sorry, wood would be used to plow the earth, to garden the soil and everything. And earth, you could build earthen dams using certain forms of clay, or whatever the ancient concept of cement was, to build dams and block the flow of water. And water can be used to put out fire, and metal won't be metal anymore if you put high temperatures with fire. So this is it's a nice concept that they had. I'm kind of oversimplifying it,
Mhm.
but they had a little bit more nuanced understanding of this. Okay, next slide. So they applied the same principle to this concept of five elements. They also had a yin and a yang,
Mhm.
which implied some sort of directionality, and also it may have been their idea of hot and cold. And the idea was that one yin organ would influence another yang organ in a similar manner that I conveyed in the what is that, the five phases. Okay,
Mhm.
next slide. So in Ayurveda also they have a similar concept. I don't want to go into too much of details because it's similar. I would say it's similar, but it's with its own unique nuances. I've mentioned it here briefly. Okay, the three bodily humors, Tridosha, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, and
Mm.
diseases due to the imbalance of the doshas. I will cover this concept a little bit more in depth along with the Greek concept of the four humors. Okay,
Just to
next slide.
add,
Yes,
the Yin Yang philosophy, the Confucius philosophy of Chinese,
yes,
if you see the symbol, it will be a circle, dark circle, and a light circle. Sorry, a circle with a half dark and half light, and it
yes,
have a one small internal circle of light and dark.
yes, yes,
Yeah, that shows that the circle is the opposite is always going to come.
yes. The
Opposite
opposite is
of
in
the current one, the truth,
the current
the
one.
opposite
Yes,
of this is in the current
yes. It's a
time
very
itself.
beautiful
Yeah,
idea.
yeah. That's a nice philosophy. I always like that to tell myself that
Yes,
whatever you are in current situation, it's going to change.
yes. It's a very nice. I keep on referencing actually yin and yang. The reason I didn't put out the picture is because I assumed that everybody would know it, would remember that yin and yang. But it's
Yeah,
used a lot in terms of explaining. There's a little bit of good in everyone, even in bad
yeah,
people. A little bit of bad in every good. So there's
yeah,
no that thing that's absolute. So that I
yeah,
really liked it because it was very different from Western concepts of absolute. Like
yes,
Plato would always believe in absolutes, and
yeah,
philosophy kind of was developed from there. So
yeah,
Chinese always maintained a very different. I mean, Eastern philosophy in general, including India,
yeah,
it retained a very unique sense of uh, this opposites and
yeah. I even have this yin and yang symbol in my school
yes,
class
yes,
and phones and all to remember remind myself.
yes.
Yeah, go on, go on.
So yes, this is the Ayurveda concept. Again, it's you can see it's somewhat similar. I just
Hmm.
wanted to put this that this is the Indian version. Okay,
Hmm.
next slide. So we have these old pictures of circumcision surgeries being done. So we know that they engaged with biology. Our ancestors engaged with biology in some way. Okay, next
Hmm.
slide. A picture of some Ayurvedic preparation for gout. Okay, next slide. So so you have to understand that actually Hippocrates was considered as one of the fathers of medicine. Obviously, there'll be many individual cultures that has its own claim, own valid claims. Hippocrates is one of the most influential ones because he was known. He was very publicly known for his teaching of professionalism and the famous sentence, "At least do no harm." So the what they used to perform at that time was to understand and document patterns of disease and explain to the person what happens. But their treatments were not very good. So they would be able to understand what is happening and do particular signs, whether it is to uh, you know uh, press the person's abdomen or to look at their face and understand something is going wrong. So we call that as a clinical sign. So they had a good understanding, a fairly good understanding for that time of what a clinical sign was. But the problem was that treatment was not really good,
Hmm.
and so they were known as prognosticians. That means prognosis, what will happen to you. But they were not really good in treatment. They could not do anything until whatever they said happened. So modern day people criticize them, saying it was a very morbid meditation of death. They would kind of wait until the patient died, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
So but one good thing that Hippocrates, um, one of the good things is that he did not believe that disease was due to superstitious reasons, that is personal, sins, or that gods were causing the disease. It was because of environmental factors, diet, and living habits. So
Hmm.
that was one of the biggest progress that Hippocrates gave.
Hmm.
And this was the standard of medical knowledge till for almost like thousands of years.
Okay.
So uh, And even though he was such a great man, his immediate successors also did not develop his knowledge, which was unfortunate. Okay, next slide. So now coming to Aristotle, who was a disciple of Plato. So Plato used to talk about heavens and everything being beautiful, and Aristotle himself had his own idea of what to search for, but he was focused on the material world, what is there around him. So Aristotle and his disciple Theophrastus, their approach to biology is resembling a modern approach. So they observed, they classified, they tried to document patterns, and so Aristotle focused on the animals and Theophrastus focused on the plants. So the problem with Aristotle was that he already had his philosophical system, and his theories of biology were based on some preconceived notions. But he would, speak of nature as if it was its own thing. Nature will decide. It depends on nature. And one bias that he had was that he felt that man was at the top, and I mean that even in a speciesistic sense, that if the invertebrates are below man, the insects were below the you know invertebrates, things like that, and that women also were inferior. Okay, next slide. So again, Aristotle's views on biology were the standard for many years, and it took until Roman Empire building, that is around 280 BC, for somebody called Lucretius, who tried to synthesize the science known at his time. So what was happening is Romans at that time were trying to give state-sponsored myths about um, about various explanations for biology and other things. So Lucretius was against that. He was basically saying that no, we are not special. Humans are not superior to animals. And he is considered as one of the earliest examples of the evolutionary theory. So he says that a lot of time was spent in thousands of years. People, these kind of whatever form of life is there, for example, what we call as a species today, they call as form of life, would develop accordingly. He said like that. But the only problem is, at that time, they believed in this concept called spontaneous generation, which is that life can come from non-living things. So, for example, a simple example of this would be if you cut a piece of meat from a butcher's shop, any meat, and you put it in the sun, say for a few days, you will see maggots and things coming out from it. So at that time, they didn't really do sophisticated experiments to find out why the maggots are coming, but they believe that non-life can lead to life in some way or another. That is how it explains the modern day. But they did not believe that one species can change to the other. Okay, but at the same time, they appreciated that there is some importance of the environment and the animal's ability to survive in that environment. They had that concept. Okay, next slide. So now we have again Galen, who finally in 150, after 150 years in the Common Era, he superseded Hippocrates and became the new standard. He believed that the body was evidence of intelligent design, and his idea of anatomy also, even though it was better than Hippocrates, it still involved pneuma, which is some kind of vital air, spirits, and vital forces. But he did a lot of experiments which clarified the function of GI system. The main problem of Galen is that he did not do dissection. So he could not find out in depth what is happening actually in the body, because for a long time, since Hippocrates' time, there was a taboo. There was a ban on doing experiments on the body. So the problem with Galen is not so much that he didn't develop, he made very good developments, but his followers, based on his system of Pneuma, spirit, and vital forces, they started doing bloodletting and complex, drug apothecaries, which may or may not be valid. What I was talking about as the materia medica, right? The complicated drug formulations. So it may not be valid soon after following Galen. The next slide, please. So, okay. So just one small point to note is that now Balaji covered the physics and mathematical developments that happened in the previous lecture. So what was happening is that the church was getting more and more restless against these kind of new scientific developments, and they found some sort of comfort in the natural world. So they felt like nature is beautiful because it reflects God's hand. So, hand in hand, natural theology arose, and that encouraged natural philosophy, at least up to a point. Okay, so a lot of these people, Thomas Aquinas, would quote Plato, Aristotle, but they would talk about it as the beauty of God. Okay, next slide. So, Renaissance. So now we have Leonardo da Vinci, doing a little bit basic kind of dissections, and dissections were done also prior to Leonardo da Vinci, but people rejected them because they felt like those people were doing it illegally, and so not a lot, because of all of this pressure, they were not able to find out in depth how the body worked. Now, in 1543, while Copernicus made the book about the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, another person important in biology wrote about on the fabric of human biology. He wrote a book like that. So he did extensive dissections and was involved in the what is that medical colleges. So there were stories about how he would steal the bones from criminals. He would go to graveyards, and one by one he would sneak them until he assembled an entire skeleton, because at that time it was taboo. And we have pictures of people, we have knowledge of people killing people just to get a good sample for dissection, a good cadaver for dissection. And Vesalius, one of his very interesting demonstrations was that he showed that the bones of the ape and man were similar, and he felt like Galen made mistakes. So maybe Galen saw some bone somewhere and thought it was a man. So Galen might have done anatomy based on other animals. But he never made dissections himself. So Vesalius became the new standard, and he would write his book, and he would encourage people to cut out pictures of his book in for readers who cannot get the actual bodies and the organs. So that was an interesting part about Renaissance. Next slide, please. So just to, in a few sentences, what happened is all of these developments in human physiology gave some idea that the body was in balance, and that all of the heart, the lungs, everything is connected in some way. Okay, and that's the concept we call as homeostasis. And there was primitive understanding of this prior to 1800s. Okay, next slide, please. So now the history of lenses has its own, beauty, and it was based on physics, and people were using lenses for a long time, and were using it to find out the not microscopic, but a little bit larger than the microscopic world, correct? The microscopic world. And one funny example is when a poet, a Swedish poet, George Sternhalm, who was a science hobbyist, he took a priest and he said, here, just look through this, and tell me what you think. And this clergyman, this priest, looked through the magnifying glass and saw a flea. You can imagine at that time, what somebody would feel when they saw something that looked so non-human at such a large kind of magnifying, whatever the magnifying potential was at that time. It still is very scary, for someone who did not understand germs and the microscopic world. So he was denounced as a sorcerer and an atheist. So the point is, we know of all of these people called Robert Hooke and Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. We study them uh, as people who, what do you say, invented the microscope. They didn't invent the microscope, but they used it and they made it better and discovered even more smaller microscopic organisms and microscopic phenomenon. Okay, so Robert Hooke was the first person who called um, a cell a cell. He would look at the section from the cork. At that time, cork was a kind of it's a kind made of a bark, I think, that was used to used to package the bottles, the top of the bottle. So he used to make these very thin slices, and it looked to him, it looked like a prisoner's cell. So he called that smallest thing a cell. And even Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, he was a very famous Dutch microscopist. He was not familiar with the science of the Europeans, and he did not read a lot of their literature. So he did his own discoveries and made extensive drawings and documentation. So Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, for example, I'll give you one a very nice story. So I think when we are being taught in school, we learn about these words called homunculus and animalcules. So at that time, they had this idea that the adult person is present in a very small form when it is being passed from male to female. So, for example, this concept called, we know this word called spermatozoa, right? Actually, zoa means animal. So it is a vestige of this of the language being used, that there was the adult form in the small person. So everybody was wondering about, what is semen. Imagine people doing microscoping on semen. It looks like as if it's small worm, a worm that is moving. Is it a parasite? Is it an infection? So Anthony van Leeuwenhoek once got a challenge. Please find out what is this. Somebody has been diagnosed as gonorrhea. What is this? Is this normal? Is it not normal? So Anthony van Leeuwenhoek would examine many persons' sperms, and he would say that no, sperms are natural. Sperms are natural, and uh, only if it is in diseased form will you get additional things in addition to the sperms. But the sperms themselves are not dangerous. Okay, next slide. So Anthony van Leeuwenhoek did this for. So imagine seeing a small louse or a flea under the microscope, and at that time you had absolutely no idea. It's like literally seeing an alien world. And imagine until that time you only saw human beings and animals, and you thought that God created them. So it would definitely be a huge fight. Okay, next slide. So this is a picture of Robert Hooke's microscope and his pictures of the cells that he used to cut. Okay, next slide. So this is what I was talking about. That so there were two dominant theories at the time that people were arguing about, that the miniature individual exists in the egg or the semen and begins to grow into its adult form with the right stimulus. That is at the right time. Then epigenesis means no. The genesis, that is the growth, happens outside. It happens after the embryo is formed. It is the embryo itself is not the adult form, but after some time, after some series of steps and stages, new parts are added. Okay, so that was the idea at that time. Next slide. Just one small note about Lavoisier. He is important in the development of chemistry. I could not cover the history of chemistry because it's quite large, but he influenced biology also because he understood that respiration and combustion were similar in that they both generated heat. Okay, next slide. So based on all of these things that Anthony van Leeuwenhoek and Robert Hooke developed and documented, cell development theory was slowly becoming accepted. And even with this, the understanding of germ theory of life became understood slowly, that okay, fine, if all life is made up of cells and all cells arise from pre-existing cells, then maybe the cells can exist by itself as a bacteria. So at this time, this understanding of germ theory of disease became it can become visualized, because a lot of I didn't specifically put a slide for germ theory of disease, but at this point of time when cell theory was developed, the concept of germ theory, that the diseases can be spread by small things, slowly could be visualized and conceptualized. Okay, next slide. So Darwin was part of a very interesting family. I just wanted to cover that before coming to Darwin and Wallace's discovery of evolution. So Erasmus Darwin was his grandfather and of Charles Darwin and Francis Galton. So Erasmus was also somebody who believed in evolution in a kind of limited way. Okay, so can you go to the next slide? So I'll just read out his quote. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm blooded animals could have arisen from one living filament? The great first cause, endued with animality, with the power of acquiring new parts, attended with new propensities, directed by irritations, sensations, volitions, and associations, and thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity and of delivering down those improvements by generation to its posterity, world without end. So we get some sense that he understood the concept of evolution, and a lot of people did. There was some kind of thing called proto-evolutionary theories at that time. Okay. And it's interesting that this person was Charles Darwin's grandfather itself. Okay, next slide. So now Lamarck is also important in this discovery of in this talk about evolutionary biology, because Lamarck believed that he believed in spontaneous generation, first of all, that life can come from non-life, and he believed that life evolves. Okay, so if you were some kind of a bacteria, over time you will evolve into a higher life form. So they had the same concept from Aristotle, that there was a great chain of being, that one form of life is higher in some sense than the other. Okay, and everything would evolve to, and man is the top. The vertebrates are higher than the invertebrates, and man would be at the top. And so that was the two drawbacks of his theory of evolution. But what is his theory? His theory is that individuals in adaptation to their environment, with gradual incremental changes, little by little, they would be able to pass those changes on to their children. So the idea was that after they are born, certain changes happen to the individual, which over their lifetime, they will be able to pass to the next generation, and the next generation will continue that slow progress. Okay, so that is his concept, which Darwin later showed to be wrong. Okay, so next slide. So evolution is the concept of evolution. So this is in itself, can take a different and very long class, a very interesting class, because this is not just related to biology. It's related to so many interesting things, and even to this day we hear, we tell people you need to evolve, you need to become the eagle and not the duck, things like that. So evolution is a very beautiful idea, And but we need to understand what exactly did Charles Darwin and Alfred Russell Wallace, what exactly did they discover? A little bit. So we have Lucretius, we have proto-evolutionary theorists, we have Erasmus Darwin, Lamarck. So now this concept, this phrase called survival of the fittest was given by Herbert Spencer. I think he was an economist and applied Charles Darwin's ideas to economics. And Wallace said, hey, look, Darwin, this guy has written this nice phrase called survival of the fittest. It is better than your word called natural selection, because selection means that somebody's choosing. But the theory itself says that nobody's choosing, it happens unconsciously. So why don't you incorporate this word into your later books? So Charles Darwin agreed with Wallace and used the term survival of the fittest in his later books. But the problem is, this concept of survival of the fittest is used to justify many unfair things. Okay, and in the history of society, it is, for example, social Darwinism, capitalist ideologies, they were used to justify competition. So there was also this pushback to this ideology in the form of Peter Kropotkin. I think he was a Russian aristocrat who is considered as important in the history of anarchism and anarchic ideas. So he believed that he said that he thinks that evolution is also important when people cooperate together, mutual aid. So that is just one small point. And even though evolution was accepted for a long time, still there was a lot of pushback. People believed in this concept called Elan Vital, that the life force in a person could direct them to achieving things that they can't imagine, and that would promote the evolution of the species. That there's a purpose to evolution. That intelligence was the crown of evolution of an organism. Okay, so next slide, please. So now, what exactly did they discover? They realized one thing, that they had a very good evidence that you can form a species from another species. And this understanding is that there is some amount of variability at the time of birth itself. And that taken together, when you have these kind of organisms that are a little bit different, they are able to survive in a particular environment, and their population, not individual, their population, when it is large enough, it can create this kind of location where even though it's the same species, they look different and behave different. And over time, the changes are significant enough that they become new species. So both of them journey to different places where the biodiversity was very high. And they noticed these small changes in different organisms. And they looked very much the same species, but they looked and behaved different. So together they both, so actually Wallace wrote Darwin a letter. Then Darwin said, hey, this is the same idea that I've been working on. So they both published their ideas together. And because Darwin had a little bit more, evidence, Wallace said, it's okay, Darwin, you write the book, the defining book on evolution, and I will support you. But Wallace himself made his own contributions to evolution. He is considered as the father of biogeography. The only difference, one of the main differences between Wallace and Darwin's understanding of evolution, was that Wallace believed that evolution had a direction and a purpose. So his books are kind of interesting to read. I haven't read them, but I kind of want to, because he believed that man had a unique role in nature. What was man's role? So this concept is called as teleology, when evolution has a direction and purpose. And this is from the time of Aristotle, that there's some teleological concepts going around. But Darwin believed that there's no purpose. Everything is random. Everything is, nobody chooses. It's just luck whether the organism can survive or thrive. And there's a lot of other factors as well. Okay, now next slide, please.
That's what I sometime back when
Hmm.
I was reading about this Wallace Darwin conversations,
Hmm.
I came across this idea, the belief of Wallace. I also haven't read Wallace, but seems that Wallace is kind of a believer, but Darwin is completely from the atheist point of view.
Correct. So yeah, so even Wallace was teleology means that there's some sort of purpose, and he felt like God preordained it, and
Yeah.
so. But both were very important at the time for this concept that species can change. It was a break from the previously existing notions of evolution, and both of them had really good evidence. But as you mentioned, they were a little bit different, and uh, Wallace had his own, beliefs, and Darwin would be considered more modern in the present day. And Darwin was, he had his own, what do you say, advantages because of his social circles and
Mm.
things like that. So next slide, please. Genetics evolution. So
One
um,
question.
yes.
During Darwin's period, there was no idea of mutation, right?
Exactly. So even Darwin himself, I forgot to mention, Darwin himself was mystified by what is the basis for variability.
Mm.
So they all had their own theories, but nothing could be, experimentally verified.
Mm.
So
Mm.
the concept of mutation only was developed when genetics was understood, and that was at a later point.
Mm.
So Mendel deserves so much of credit. Okay, even so, the thing is, unfortunately, Mendel's work, we don't know to what extent it was influential in his immediate future, because he is a priest. He is a priest who's doing experiments on plants, on the pea plants, and nobody seems to care about whether the plant is red, green, brown, whether it's half red, green, brown, you know. But the
Mm.
fact that Mendel had this kind of scientific spirit where he interpreted different variants of the same species, he discovered various principles of heredity, and he theorized that it is somewhere in some discrete units are present, and those units in each organism will influence, um, will what is that, interact with the units in the other organism when it gets passed out. So you'll have things like dominance, independent assortment, and segregation. I'll give you one example. So for example, okay, I don't know the details of the experiment, but suppose you have a, a red a red pea plant and like a green pea plant. If you what do you say, if you mix them together, if you cross if you fertilize them together, whenever you do this test, suppose you get only red plants as the child, then we kind of have an understanding that some hereditary unit in the red plant is dominating the manifestation of the physical features. And even if half of it is there in the child, it will be there.
Mm.
Okay. But the beauty about all of this is he's been able to do this just by looking at the external features of these plants. That was the beauty. He discovered these principles of genetics just by looking at the external features of the pea plant. So now I just wanted to argue that his work fell into oblivion in the recent for the few years after he published his work, because there was no conceptual understanding of what it would look like, of what
Mm.
genes would look like. So we have developments like Frederick Meichner, who isolated essentially DNA from the nucleus of the cell, and he felt like it is interesting, but he didn't know what it was.
Mm.
And after so many years, after more than 10 years, Walter Fleming discovered chromosomes. Chromo means color. Soma means body. It is a colorful body, so named after the staining principles. Then rediscover of Mendel's work by botanists, Hugo Vries and Carl Correns. So when they discovered it, they were like, okay, we have to publish our discovery, but we have to give Mendel the credit. So that was a very good thing on their part. They did not, when they rediscovered Mendel, they did not take the credit for themselves. They co-credited Mendel for uh, preceding them in their discoveries of genetic principles. And Thomas Hunt Morgan later felt that whatever is the genes, that is the unit of transmission of inheritance, that was somewhere on the chromosome. That also theory was there. And after a while, all of these ideas were combined in Ronald Fisher's book that combined evolution and genetics, and it formed the basis for population genetics. So it became a mathematical, you could understand it mathematically. Okay, next slide, please.
Yeah. One interesting fact about Mendel is, looks like Mendel applied for a job as a biology teacher,
Yes.
and he was rejected.
Yes.
I believe that. So he was rejected as a biology teacher. Yeah.
A lot of these so-called fathers of the disciplines, there was really no space for them because they had to break with the existing notions at the time.
Yeah.
They had to break, and it can come either by ignorance, that is, they won't know what is going on, or they would have had to been rejected in some way by the community at some level, so that they can work on isolation in order to make that kind of progress. So that seems to be the trend for these kind of developments. But that's a very interesting point. So thank you.
Yeah.
Molecular biology, biochemistry, and microbiology. So we hear about Schrodinger's wave theory of quantum mechanics, but he also speculated that the unit of life, what is there maybe within the chromosomes, was in some sort of crystal that was not completely uh, that contains some kind of information. When we say periodic crystal would be like a regular crystal. Like for example, a salt crystal is a regular crystal because it's only made up of repeating patterns of sodium chloride. But an aperiodic crystal would be something that contains some information because it encodes information in a longer format. So he speculated that it was there. He what do you say? I wouldn't say he developed an idea or people were influenced by him, but definitely reading his book, uh, a lot of people would go into biology at that time. So Rosalind Franklin and Watson and Crick together, they discovered the structure of DNA. Okay, based on a lot of principles of uh, X-ray crystallography and diffraction techniques, and soon after there were a lot of chemical advances, biochemical advances to understand the different pathways of life in all organisms and what exactly is the role of ATP and mitochondria, that is in the cells. Next slide.
One fact about this
Yes.
What is Life, the book by Schrodinger.
Yes.
That Schrodinger talks about bringing entropy, the idea
Yes.
of
Yes.
entropy to explain life. That is what
Yes.
the book is about. So
Yes.
entropy is about the measure of
Disorder.
irregularity, yeah, uncertainty, right? So that he brings into life. It's a nice
Yes.
small book, some 30-35 pages. Nice.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a very good point. Um, so a lot of people feel like um, the reason why that point is very important is because people have this understanding that uh, influenced by the sort of Elan Vital and the vital forces and things like that, that there's some sort of energy you keep hearing people, especially pseudoscientists, talk about some sort of energy in the body. The energy is flowing, energy is flowing. So
Mm.
people felt like that life is because of energy.
Mm.
There's some form of energy creation and energy destruction. So physicists, I think a lot of physicists, but especially Schrodinger, because he documented it and put it for the public.
Mm.
He captured the public's imagination. The physicists, I think, in general, understood that it is not so much about energy, but about this kind of entropy. That what was happening in human beings or in life was that entropy was increasing, but
Mm.
the living organisms disposed the waste. The whole reason why they're taking food and they are, disposing it through urine or feces is because they are trying to avoid entropy
Yeah.
by um removing those waste products and therefore maintaining a somewhat low entropy. So that was a very good insight that he kind of brought into this concept of what is life. That is very correct. So coming to molecular genetics, so once the DNA was identified, people started developing. Okay, fine. Now one gene is there. How will that influence the body? How do proteins grow? How do Is it an enzyme? What is happening? So there's this understanding that DNA forms this thing. What is that? DNA forms RNA. RNA is used to create proteins, and proteins are what build up the body. And it goes a little bit back and forth in different organisms, but that is essentially what happens. But obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. And next slide. So um, now, after all of this discovery of genes, of DNA, there was something called the epigenetic survival. So Lamarckism may be true in a limited sense. So let me ask anyone a question, whoever wants to answer. Do you think? Okay, so let's just review what we discovered so far in with regards to. I'm sorry that it's coming a little bit long. I think I'll take another 15 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah. We have 10:30 to 12, right?
Okay, okay. So just to review what we've discovered so far. So people have discovered that there are two cell lines that in your body, for the most part, you have the somatic cell, which contains both your father's chromosomes and mother's chromosomes in every cell. And there's this idea that uh, whatever is there in your somatic cell, in your, for example, your eye or your hair or your hands or your heart, that cannot be transferred to uh, your children, your next generation. All of that information that is there in those cells cannot be transferred. Okay, so then how is it transferred? So what happens is in the sex cells that is there in the ovaries and the testes, specialized forms of the cells are created by a process of meiosis, where the cells divide and only half of the information from the combination of your each person's parents are stored in either the sperms or the eggs in the ovary. Sperms in the testis and eggs in the ovaries. And only whatever happens, whatever information is there in the sex cells, only that gets transmitted to the next generation. Okay. So now I'm going to ask everyone on this group, a question. Do you feel there are certain changes you can make to your body? Okay, certain growths to your body after you have finished the normal process of growth up to the point of say 18 to 21 years of age. Can you grow beyond that? An open question to anyone.
Mm.
And I don't mean only as skin cells or hair or, you know, is more growth possible is my question. Because
Growth,
if it is
I think it is possible or it is happening.
okay,
Because cancer is another kind of growth.
very good,
The cell is extra doing some other work instead of doing the regular work, right?
correct.
Yeah. So I think that's possible.
Okay, very good. So now the second question is, do you feel that whatever growth that happens to whatever changes that happens to an adult, to a person after being born, can that influence the next generation? Because Darwin didn't believe that. Darwin's whole refutation of Lamarckism is that no, Lamarck, you are wrong, because you are saying that people change after they are born. People change after they are born, and no, that is not the reason why changes happen. Changes happen because people are born a little bit differently. There's a variation, and that variation is incremental. Each generation varies a little bit differently at birth.
Mhm.
But Lamarck said no, people change a little bit during the course of their life, and they are able to transmit that. So my question is Lamarck true? Is what Lamarck said was true?
I think that is what this mutation is all about, right? That means you during your lifetime, you may acquire something because of mutation, some sudden change in some parts of the body.
Okay,
That can happen in the genetic information and that can be passed to your, that may be get passed to your next generation.
okay. So that's a very good, that's a very good answer. That's a very good answer. So I'll give you a little bit of what is that feedback on that question, on that answer. So when a mutation happens, it occurs at the level of genes. So the
Mhm.
basis of mutation is actually the fidelity, that is the fidelity of DNA repair. I'll explain what that means. So, for example, if you are copying, if you are copying the, let's say, a book, a small 50-page book onto a piece of paper, if you copy it exactly with the same spelling and same handwriting, same pictures, then you are copying it with high fidelity. But if you make certain errors while you are copying it, you make some typo errors, you you accidentally missed a line, you're copying it with low fidelity. So the same thing happens in DNA repair. So different organisms have different levels of fidelity in their transmission of DNA.
Mhm.
Okay, within a body, you can have some person who made a mistake. Or some cell which made a mistake and which has a little bit different variation. So mutations can even occur within a person. That is very correct after they are born, and mutations can be inherited. But the point I wanted to convey is that I'll give you an example of a disease. Okay, so there's a disease called retinoblastoma in a child. So if you get a retinoblastoma gene from both your parents, okay, uh, that is diseased, the diseased form of that gene, then you will, let's say let's say Jack. If Jack gets his both the retinoblastoma genes from his parent, that is a what is that a diseased form, he will get a disease called retinoblastoma. He will go blind. He will go blind when he is just a boy, and it's a cancer. Okay, that is one option. Second option is he will, if he gets one disease gene from his either mother or father, then he has one half of the disease. That is, but it won't present until he has both copies. Now, within the course of his life, if he gets a mutation in the course of his life, he can get the second copy of the diseased retinoblastoma gene and he can get cancer. But the important point to note is that if he was to what is that? If he was to have a child and give the what is the give the give his genes to his children,
Mhm.
they he will give it in a 50-50 manner because his sex cells are not influenced by the somatic cells. The point in which I wanted to make is that even if you get a mutation in your life,
Hmm.
that mutation will not get carried over to the uh,
Next.
child.
Hmm.
So what they discovered was that there is something beyond genetics. There is something beyond genetics, and that is what is called as epigenetics. So
Oh.
what is this epigenetics? Epigenetics is now when you're having the DNA to be copied and repaired and everything like that, you will have a complex process that is like a factory that holds the DNA together, that pushes it in some place, that transfers it from one place to another. Okay, all of that or inactivates certain genes. Okay, inactivation of genes. So, for example, in women, they have two X chromosomes. They have two X chromosomes. They sometimes for certain genes, one half of the X chromosome is inactivated. This
Hmm.
is called as methylation, DNA methylation. It gets inactivated by adding some methyl group. Okay,
Okay.
so this is one example of an epigenetic change. That is, even though there is some genetics information, what is happening in the body is happening beyond the level of genetics. Okay, so it is possible for the sex cells, while they are dividing and while they're changing, and while that they'll have certain epigenetical changes, and the epigenetical changes can get transmitted to the next generation. So, for example, we say that human beings and apes are 99% similar, right? The huge portion of that 1% difference is because of epigenetic changes rather than genetic changes.
I
So,
see.
okay, I'm not saying everything, but a huge portion of that.
Hmm.
Okay, next slide, please. The point is, Lamarckism is back in a limited sense. That
Hmm.
yes, you can have uh, certain changes over one's lifetime, and that can get transmitted to the next generation. But the degree to which that happens, as Lamarck explained, is not. It doesn't happen exactly like that. But there is a molecular basis for Lamarckism in a limited sense. Okay, that is not related to genetics, but it does involve evolution. Okay, okay. Now, so CRISPR is some recent developments. If you heard of genetic modification or gene editing, they usually refer to this and technologies that is influenced by this developments based on this technology. So we've come to we are such progressing on the genetics thing, science and advances. Okay, next slide. So okay, I don't think we have time for this. I'll explain later.
We can do
Okay.
it next lesson also.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
that. Okay.
We'll do this particular thing next time because it's not related to biology so much as
Hmm.
I would
Hmm.
say politics or
Yeah.
maybe I'll just talk about it briefly. So
Okay.
Darwin was influenced by a very popular essay that was written by, say, Thomas Malthus.
Mhm.
And what Darwin was liked about this essay was a particular sentence called the, the this battle for resources. Okay, but the problem is the person who wrote it, his actual argument and the way his argument was influenced society and even biology was in a somewhat backward way. Okay, I'll cover this maybe another time when I'm maybe during discussion. Um, but this is a very interesting point that I want to convey later. So next slide. So this is there are a lot of misuses of biology. So Malthus's argument is used as a kind of pseudo form of eugenics. Okay, so a lot of people use biological differences as justification for race, for sexual, what do you say, importance that men are more women, sexism, and eugenics that, there's some Aryan race. That was basically what Hitler did. And also, to some extent, it is influenced by Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, who was a genius in his own right. But a lot of these really smart people believed that intelligent people deserve to live, and it was because of the genes. So we should not have these smart people, these poor people who are not smart. They are kind of making things worse. So there's this ideology was a little bit is and was dangerous. And even this how capitalists would use social Darwinism, that the best may the best product win.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things.
Social Darwinism is a failure theory, right? That we should.
Yes. So this I'd like to cover maybe at a later point because it's a little bit in depth. Okay, next slide, please. So I finally want to actually end with talking about this person. He is not actually very well known in the history of biology, but um, in intellectual circles and people who like mathematics, they somehow come across him. So Darcy Wentworth Thompson is actually, I think he's either a mathematician or a physicist or both. And he decided to look to nature to try and explain why organisms have a growth and a form that doesn't depend exactly on evolutionary explanations. So he's trying to show that, see, there's some sort of physics and mathematics going on when certain things are growing. And next slide, please.
What
So,
is
for
the
example,
Philip Ball?
Philip Ball is an author who explains Darcy Wentworth Thompson in a modern way.
Oh, okay.
I'll be talking on growth and form in the next couple of slides. So for example, this concept of this golden spiral, it's not just there in a single snail. A lot of organisms have that, and even though the understanding of the beauty of the Fibonacci sequence and the logarithmic spiral was it was noticed at the time of Renaissance even. Uh, 1 second, hold on. I'm sorry, I had some technical problem. Can you hear me?
Sorry?
Yes, we're able to hear you.
Okay. So Darcy Wentworth Thompson, he looked at all of the organisms and tried to find out what was the physical reason that they had a particular shape or form. Okay, next slide. So, for example, this is a very famous picture that we see, explaining how maths and biology is related. So he did quite a lot of work that explained how you don't really need to explain uh, the form as belonging to the species or the genetics. You just need a particular kind of algorithm It just needs to grow in this manner, at a certain rate. And then the kind of form it takes will be just dependent on that kind of algorithm that the organism follows. So this is one example of that. Next slide. And another example would be the horns. The horns would twist in its own unique way. It doesn't really depend on the species. The species is not deciding to produce that particular form, and whether it is the spots or whether it is different physical features of the organism, it's due to so much more than just the genes. So Darcy, the problem with Darcy is that he, next slide, please. For example, this kind of beautiful arrangement of the leaves and of the flowers patterns is called as phyllotaxis. That is the arrangement of it on the flower. So he understood that it follows the Fibonacci sequence or a variation of the Fibonacci sequence, and it forms these very beautiful crisscross connections. Next slide, please. And
So
also,
basically, he's saying that more than genes, some algorithms are at work.
Yeah. The thing was, he did not actually believe in evolution in an important way, or he didn't give it enough importance. But having said that, I think that he went to show that there are a lot of physical processes involved in nature that can be explained by physical processes rather than or why the organisms have a particular shape, right? We can see it is because of nature, but that doesn't really tell us much. So he tells us it is based on surface tension, it is based on these kind of algorithmic things, So that is what was, I would say, his contribution, that he showed that beyond the nature nurture description of why organisms have their particular shape, it is influenced by physics, physics and chemistry and the physical world and algorithms. So that was his contribution. Okay, next slide. So this is just a picture showing that this is influenced by certain artists actually who did woodcutting by Albert Dürer. So influenced by these artists, he felt like if you kind of squeeze up a picture of some fish, it'll look like another species altogether. That was his beautiful understanding of transformations. Next slide, please. Okay, it's not coming. Okay, I'm so sorry. The picture is not coming. Okay, previous slide. So there were so many more, pictures of these fishes and how each, you can modify and stretch it out a little bit and it will look exactly like a different species. So it was a very nice, comparison and mathematical basis he was using. So now coming to the use and misuse of biology and evolution.
Probably.
Next. Can you go to the next slide? One more slide. Okay, so I think I'll end with this slide. Okay. So the problem with biology is that I didn't cover it so much, but there was a lot of church resistance against this idea that you could evolution exists, because it kind of removes this idea that you need God to create species, and humans don't have a special place. So in some sense, that belief on the specialness of humans, or the fact that there's something beyond the material world, up till that point it was supported by whatever biological theory was there, vital forces, animal spirits. But slowly and slowly, our understanding of biology is that it's a very complicated set of molecules acting together that we can't recreate, because it's like a closed system. As soon as we interact with it, it will lose its beauty. Whatever functioning happens, it loses itself. So it's a system that propagates, but it propagates beyond human control. or any control of any living creature. And maybe we can influence it to some degree, like when we are breeding animals and things like that, and maybe even at CRISPR gene editing. But in some sense, biology really, what is that? Makes a person come face to face with their spirituality and question, what really do you believe beyond the material world? And I feel like we need to bring back actually this deep belief that all life is sacred, and that animals are just like humans, in the sense that, just because they don't speak doesn't mean we disregard their experience. They're unintelligent. We can't say things like that. And we really need to understand that whatever we are doing, we're doing it on this planet Earth, that everything is connected. And if we don't understand ecology and we don't understand biological systems, uh, there's a very high chance that human beings will cause their own extinction. Whether they are uh, pursuing AI or whatever, nuclear weapons. And whenever we are going and discovering new places, we're doing deforestation, we're getting new diseases upon ourselves. And the one point I want to convey is that, the greatest tragedy of our life is that more than human beings dying, we're killing entire species. Per day, an unimaginable number of species are being eliminated. We're ending the species, and that's a tragedy we don't talk about in the news. So we really need uh, to find some way of developing the sense of what is important in the biological system sense of the word, ecology, deep ecology, and reverence for life, as conveyed by Albert Schweitzer.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for this opportunity. And I hope I conveyed some sense of it.
Definitely, Judah. It was excellent session. Yeah, it's 12 o'clock already. I will let the team go. Thanks for having a detailed session, giving us some enlightenment on this biology field. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was very informative.